Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to discuss the spotted lanternfly and its threat to the California winegrape industry. My name is Natalie Collins, and I am the Director of Member Relations at the California Association of Winegrape Growers. Today's webinar is co-hosted by the California Association of Winegrape Growers, Wine Institute, and the Family Winemakers of California. These three groups work diligently, effectively, and cooperatively in the interests of wineries and growers alike. And on today's webinar, we have representatives from each organization. I'd like to first introduce you to my colleague, Michael Miller, who is COG's Director of Government Relations.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, and I want to especially thank CDFA for their role in putting this together, and our industry partners, Wine Institute and Family Winemakers. This is an important issue. We became aware of this probably a year and a half ago, and we're glad that the PD GWIS board has designated this as a threat to California wine grapes, and I'm sure that this is going to be very informative, and I appreciate your participation. With that, let me introduce Tyler Blackney with Wine Institute.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. My name is Tyler Blackney. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for Wine Institute in the Sacramento office. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, COG. Specifically, thank you, Natalie, for being the catalyst that pulled us all together today. I'll keep my comments very brief and just further thank the California Department of Food and Agriculture for getting in front of what could be a very devastating pest for the California wine industry, one that we hope never gets here, but we definitely need to be prepared and for this potentially real threat. With that, I look forward to learning along with all the other participants on the phone today, and just say again, thank you, California Department of Food and Agriculture, for pulling us together. Back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Tyler. And let me introduce Pete Downs with California Family Winemakers.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Natalie, thank you for setting this up, and I'll kind of mirror Tyler's remarks on CDFA as well. As the kind of elder statesman on this call, I guess, having been in the industry 50 years, I want to give you just a brief background on a couple of other challenges that we faced. The first, of course, was Pierce's disease, and that showed up in California actually in 1994, but it really got on everybody's radar in 1999 with the devastation of 300 acres of grapes in Temecula. At that point, Bill Lyons was Secretary of Agriculture, and he formed the PD board. It was made up of 6 growers, 6 producers, and 1 general member from just nobody involved in the industry. And I was lucky enough at that point to be working for Kendall Jackson as Senior Vice President for External Affairs, and Secretary Lyon appointed me to that board. At that point, we didn't know very much about GWIS at all. The sharpshooter, with our knowledge, was very, very small, and we knew even less about Xylella. So it took us we're 20 plus years into it. Our knowledge base is certainly much broader, and we're starting to see some potential solutions come out, but the ability to control the spread of GWIS has been very important. The second one that I want to talk about is the European grapevine moth, which showed up in California in 2009 in a small vineyard in Napa. And we handled that one a little bit differently and controlled it immediately, kept it contained, and eventually in 2016, we had a meeting at Mondavi Winery in Napa to announce the eradication of that particular pest. And I was lucky enough to be there as well. Now we've got a new one, the spotted lanternfly. I'm really glad to see that we're going to jump on this early before it gets here. That's extremely important. We need to be diligent in not only locating it if and when it does show up, because I think it is when, and continuing to work on it. So thanks again for CDFA and everybody involved, and Family Winemakers, of course, is at your disposal if we can help at all. Thanks.
Thank you, Pete.
Okay.
And before I turn it back to Natalie, just want to say the California Association of Winegrape Growers has been working with our industry partners, but also with other commodities and making people aware of this potential threat to California produce in general. And we want to, thank them as well. People starting to engage in this. The awareness is growing thanks to CDFA. And Pete, we really appreciate your experience, and Tyler, thank you as well. And a special thanks to Natalie. And with that, I'll hand it back to Natalie.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, Tyler, and Pete for your guys' partnership and promotion of today's webinar. So before we dive in, I want to quickly review the format of the webinar. We'll begin with a 45-minute presentation and then open it up for Q&A. We will not be stopping during the presentation to answer questions. However, we encourage you to submit questions on your dashboard as we go. If you'd like to ask a question verbally, simply raise your hand on the dashboard and I will unmute you so you can do so. We will get to all of the questions at the conclusion of the webinar. And lastly, a recording of this webinar will be available, which will be sent to everybody on the call this afternoon. It will also be available through COG Wine Institute or Family Winemakers. So now, without further delay, today's webinar will provide an overview of spotted and lanternfly efforts in California, review detection and regulatory possibilities, and discuss what growers can do to be on the lookout for this invasive pest. We are very fortunate to have two presenters from the California Department of Food and Agriculture join us today. The first is Dr. Andrew R. Cline, who is the Assistant Director of the Plant Health and Pest Prevention Services Division, and also the Acting Statewide Coordinator for the Pierce Disease Control. Dr. Cline, thank you for joining us, and I will turn the presentation over to you to introduce our second presenter today.
Thank you, Natalie. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate your time this morning to participate in this presentation. Before I introduce Matt, I just wanted to let folks know that our Division Director for Plant Health and Pest Prevention Services, Nick Condos, will also be participating. But now on to our presenter, Dr. Matt Kaiser. Matt is the State Survey Coordinator with the Pest Detection Emergency Projects Branch at CDFA, where he works with federal, state, and county staff to conduct surveys for new and invasive agricultural pests. He also has a background in agricultural pest research, in particular biological control. So with that, I'll let Matt go ahead and get us started on this presentation.
All right, thanks, Andy, and thank you all for the opportunity to talk about a pest today that's receiving a lot of attention nationally, and that we in California as a whole, but especially the grape growers should be aware of. So here's spotted lanternfly. It is a hemipteran insect, so similar to aphids, sharpshooters, plant hoppers, things like that. They have a mouth that is a little bit like a straw, but they stick into the plant and drink the juices out of the plant. They produce honeydew as they do this, so they consume more fluids than they can, or they need to consume more fluids to get nutrients out, and so the excess comes out as honeydew, which can be a little bit of a nuisance and can also accumulate on leaves as sooty mold and disrupt photosynthesis. It's a fairly large insect, so it's up to about an inch long. Specimen on the top right, you can see with its wings outstretched, it's almost a 2-inch wingspan, which for a sort of agricultural pest insect is relatively very large. They're native to East Asia, particularly China and some surrounding parts of sort of subtropical Southeast Asia, but they've also, in 2004, invaded the Korean Peninsula, and over the course of about 3 years became pretty well established there. They're primarily associated with tree of heaven, Ailanthus altissima, which also grows here in California and is a fairly weedy tree. Once you know what it is and start looking for it, you realize that it's everywhere, but particularly in abandoned lots, rail yards, along the edge of rail lines, other places like that. It really grows everywhere, right on the side of the road even. But the the big concern that we have is its ability to feed on a lot of other plants, but particularly what we're concerned about is the feeding that we're observing in the eastern U.S. on grapes in particular. So they're just kind of covering the pictures that we've got on here. So they're on the right are a couple of adults. The middle on the bottom is a picture of the nymphs. So these insects as adults kind of lay their eggs on anything. They'll lay them on rail cars, on trucks, on lawn furniture, on firewood, on just about anything. They overwinter as eggs, and then the next spring will come out as nymphs, feed on sort of a variety of foliage, kind of whatever they can find nearby that's palatable to them. And then as they tend to congregate towards Tree of Heaven for some period. It's still not clear whether they need to feed on Tree of Heaven or not. And then from there, they disperse into the surrounding landscape, and that's where we're seeing them really hit grapes back east. So that's kind of a brief overview of the biology. We can talk about now sort of what the current status of things are in terms of where it is. As of March of this year, is the sort of most up-to-date version of their current distribution. So the blue shaded area is where evidence of reproducing populations has been found. So that's where egg masses have been found, or mated females laying eggs, things like that. So that's in, well, we're up to 6 states now where that's been observed. It was initially detected in Pennsylvania in 2014 in Berks County, and has sort of progressively spread from there. It's thought that it originally got here as an egg mass on imported stone near the property where it was initially reported in late 2014, where there were large numbers of unusual insects, was the call that came in to Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. They found that nearby was a stone importer that was receiving lots of stone and packing material from China that was sitting outside for several years. So that's how we think it got here. As I mentioned, there's 6 states with infestations and 10 states that have had detections. Some of those have been sort of one-off adults where then they've looked for more and haven't found them. There are 5 states with state interior quarantines. This is the kind of first pest of its kind that USDA is really taking a more states-first approach. They're funding a lot of the efforts against it currently in the East Coast, but really leaving the regulatory response up to the individual states. Here in California, last year in 2019, we did find some dead adults on air cargo flights that were coming from Pennsylvania into California. CDFA conducts inspections of a lot of the air cargo flights that come from this part of the country looking for Japanese beetle, which has been shown to move around the country in these planes. And so in conducting those inspections, some adults were found. They were dead by the time they were here, and we're hopeful that that's a relatively low-risk pathway, just because the pregnant females tend not to fly very long distances and seem unlikely to end up on a plane, and also they're most likely to get dried out on the plane before they would make it all the way out here to the West Coast. So that's a little bit of information about where it is now. So we can kind of look forward and try to understand where it could be. So there has been work done on this front. This is an image of habitat suitability prediction map based on a number of factors, including temperature, precipitation, and the range of that tree of heaven, where that grows, because it seems like that's where it really builds up its population. So initial attempts to project suitability across the U.S. were done when it first showed up in 2014 and 2015, but that was largely reliant on data from the Pest's native range in Asia. And unfortunately, it seems to thrive in habitats that we didn't think it would thrive in here. And so they had to rework some of the estimates of where it could survive. On the right, you can see California, and basically the entire grape growing region of California is potentially highly suitable for spotted lanternfly. We'll jump into it so you can actually sort of see what we're looking at. Hopefully this will work. We're standing in a vineyard in Pennsylvania. If your screen's big enough, those are not birds that are flying overhead. That's spotted lanternfly cascading into a vineyard from a nearby woodlot. They tend to build up and climb up trees and then sort of flutter and glide into the surrounding landscape, and especially into crops like vineyards. This is a vineyard that's getting ready to harvest, and unfortunately is getting heavily colonized by spotted lanternfly. So you all are interested in grapes, and we are too, especially because this pest seems to hit them so hard. So talking about the impacts to grapes, the lower left-hand picture is an illustration of the sooty mold that I mentioned. So as these insects are feeding, they're excreting sort of excess sugar water from the plants, and it's ending up all over the leaves, and that's attracting a fungus, sooty mold, that then grows on the surface and obstructs the plants from being able to conduct photosynthesis. But really more concerning than that is that we've seen that feeding on the vines is actually reducing freeze tolerance and affecting fruit set the following year, and even more substantially actually killing vines. And so there are small vineyards in Pennsylvania that are just fields of sticks now, unfortunately. So when this pest initially showed up, we were concerned that it would feed on a number of other host commodities like peaches, other stone fruit, also apples. And we have seen feeding evidence on those, but really haven't seen the kind of economic damage that we've been seeing on grapes. It's really, grape seems like the thing that's getting hammered the hardest. Going on to sort of what the impacts are and sort of how they come about, well, the peak feeding by the spotted lanternfly in grapes is really sort of near and at harvest, which presents a lot of issues. The rest of the season, they can be present in grapes, but they can be feeding on other things. But in the infested area in Pennsylvania especially, they're seeing sort of the heaviest feeding right at harvest. And so there is concern that the amount of feeding by these large numbers of very large insects is pulling so much sugar and so much nutrients out of the vines that it's actually affecting the ripening of the grapes and the sugar content of the grapes. Sort of additional challenge or concern is that the happen repeatedly. If a grower is going to try to spray their way out of this pest, they're going to need to juggle that spraying with their harvest calendar. And so if in terms of what products you can use and what the pre-harvest interval is and what kind of residue thresholds you need to meet on your grapes before they're harvested, can really has been putting growers in a real pickle. So I mentioned spraying. That's been sort of the major way that it's been dealt with, at least in grapes. This picture on the right is a picture of a vineyard sort of right around harvest, and what looks like a gray mulch around the base of the vines is just piles of dead spotted lanternflies. This picture was taken shortly after the extension entomologist with Penn State University that took the picture said the growers were spraying weekly at the time, and she even recommended that they be spraying more often, but they couldn't because they were trying to, like I said, juggle their harvest to sort of take place between their treatments. And so it was really, they're spraying and ending up with piles of dead spotted lanternflies and still not getting ahead of the game. But the issue is that continuing to surrounding trees and landscape. And so, yes, a grower can spray, and a few days later, they're starting to fly back into the vineyard from the surrounding area. They're not as sort of restricted to grapes as many other grape pests. A lot of the insecticides that are being used so far are neonicotinoids and pyrethroids. They're against the nymphs and adults, and like I said, the retreatment seems to is necessary. Unfortunately, there is no targeted organic product that is available to use against these. There is a product that uses Bavaria, an entomopathogenic fungi, a fungus that kills insects, but that's a very sort of broad spectrum product that seems to, it can work against the spotted lanternflies, not to the extent as some of the chemical products, but it's also very non-specific and can end up hitting sort of all sorts of insects. It's not a very fine-tuned option. Unfortunately, the only chemical product that seems to be working well against the eggs back east is chlorpyrifos, which, as we know here in California, is basically a non-starter at this point. Sort of only other strategy against the eggs has been manually scraping them off of surfaces, which with their sort of ability to lay them everywhere is basically a logistical impossibility to actually catch up with them. Another management strategy that's being used in the east, or is being attempted, is removal of tree of heaven. This tree, there's a picture of it on the right. There's a lot of challenges with this, though. So what the current response guidelines are back east is every new detection area, they'll draw a quarter-mile circle around the detection and cut down as many tree of heaven as they can find, treat the stumps with an herbicide because otherwise they'll sprout right back, and then leave a few large trees behind and treat them with a systemic insecticide as a sort of trap tree, so that the idea being if there's spotted lanternflies flying around, they'll land on the tree, feed on it, and then die. This is another sort of not very feasible strategy, or at least very challenging strategy for us in California, for a couple of reasons, beyond just the logistics, but also if we're going to try to make or meet CEQA compliance, or California Environmental Quality Act, that's going to be basically impossible with the treatment of herbicides and cutting down trees that may be on private property, maybe trees that people don't want to be cut down. And the tree itself, while yes, it's a non-native tree that some people consider weedy, it's a little bit harder to justify that in terms of that action in terms of CEQA, because it could have a lot of unintended impacts. There are other things working in the sort of pipeline that could be potential tools. Biocontrol is being investigated, both with parasitic wasps that lay their eggs in and kill the eggs. This is probably not something that's going to be a kind of golden ticket solution, just in terms of these kinds of insects, these plant hoppers, and the parasitic wasps that attack them tend not to be particularly specific. So yes, they may lay their eggs, they may attack and kill the spotted lanternfly egg masses, but not very specifically, and they may have impacts on sort of other insects that maybe we don't necessarily want to be impacted. Also being investigated are more entomopathogenic fungi, or these fungi that kill insects. There's some work happening at Penn State and Cornell looking at those. Another idea that's been thrown around is the concept of using biocontrol against tree of heaven in the form of a plant pathogen, a verticillium wilt, that could be used to sort of knock back and reduce the tree of heaven population on a sort of broader scale. Again, not a sort of immediate pest management strategy for an individual vineyard, but sort of a more area-wide, long-term control and prevention strategy. EGBM was mentioned in the introduction, and this is another pest and sort of the last one that we faced in California as sort of a new pest from somewhere else in grapes, and we did a pretty good job of getting on top of, and we're happy to be able to say that it's been eradicated from California for several years now. But we'd like to point out some of the differences between EGBM and spotted lanternfly. So just for one, spotted lanternfly is a lot larger insect. This is them to scale side by side. So it's a large insect, and so having a lot of them feeding, it's just pulling a lot of nutrients out of the plant. But sort of more than that, a big part of our ability to get on top of European grapevine moth was the existence of an extremely effective pheromone lure that we could use to detect low levels of infestation in new areas. So, we could put out tons of traps with a really effective lure. We knew that if there were EGBM out there, they would end up in our traps. And then we would find them in the traps, and then we could apply whatever control to that immediate area. For spotted lanternfly, there is no such lure. There are some lures that are being investigated, but again, just the biology of these kinds of insects, these plant hoppers, they tend not to have lures that are as specific and as attractive as things like Lepidoptera or some beetles or other organisms like that. Along with the lure is also mating disruption was a very effective tool against European grapevine moth. And again, because we don't have that pheromone, that's not something that we have against spotted lanternfly. One other sort of regulatory hurdle is human-mediated dispersal for EGBM was, relatively limited to host material and ag equipment that was being used in vineyards or being stored in vineyards, and having potential plant residue sort of on those materials. So if you could lock that down and regulate the movement of sort of the host material itself, you could really restrict the movement of the moth. For spotted lanternfly, because they like to lay their eggs on pretty much everything, suddenly almost everything becomes a potential conveyance that can spread it to a new area. So everything from a truck that happened to be, parked on the side of the road for an hour to rail cars, again, lawn furniture, and in addition to tractors, agricultural equipment, other stuff like that. So it's a lot more challenging in that way to clamp down on the human-mediated movement. EGBM was really well studied in its native range. It had been a pest in Europe for a long time, and so there was a lot of literature and established control methods. For spotted lanternfly, it's not yet that well studied. It is not a substantial pest in its native range. We're still sort of working out the answers to why. But in addition to that, sort of since it's gotten into the U.S., it seems to be, not exactly acting the same as it has been in its native range. And so what I mean by that is just in terms of the climates that it seems to be thriving in, and also its propensity for, flying right past other hosts that we thought it attacked and getting right into the grapes. A challenge with spotted lanternfly, in addition to it moving around by people, is it does move around fairly readily in the landscape. So it can move back and forth between trees in the landscape and into a vineyard. And so, as I mentioned before, folks are spraying their vineyard and having it recolonized in a matter of days to an economic threshold, almost immediately. Spotted lanternfly also, we've already seen it has the ability to actually kill vines. European grapevine moth, the damage was it's an impactful, it's an important pest, and it's very damaging. But the damage was largely restricted to foliage and to the fruit. And even if harvest is disrupted and yield is really knocked down one year, there's a good ability to sort of jump back from that in the future. Now, kind of above all of these things, spotted lanternfly is just it's a nuisance where it is. It's an issue. People don't like it. It's a large insect. It freaks people out. It flies around. It hits you in the face. It accumulates on the sides of buildings. It's raining that honeydew all over, patios and patio furniture, and people just don't like it. So it's it's not, just another small brown moth that flutters by at night. It's really something that's active and gets in people's faces. So enough of the kind of doom and gloom. We can talk about sort of what we can actually do and what we've done so far. So spotted lanternfly has a A rating. It's an A-rated pest from the state primary entomologist in California. What that means is that it's what we call an actionable pest. It's a pest that that A rating allows us, the state, to respond to it sort of once we find it within the state. As mentioned before, it's also been designated a pest of concern by the Pierce's Disease Control Program. So the kind of foundation of being able to have a response to it is there. We've also been conducting trainings for county regulatory staff, both within the Plant Health Division and the Pierce's Disease Control Program, sort of with pictures, videos, showing folks what to look for. There's a lot of trained personnel that are out there in the field, and so hopefully, they would notice it if they see it. We've sent a number of what we call advisories to state and the county agricultural commissioners with information about the pest biology. Again, kind of what to look for, pictures, videos. Again, just trying to get sort of as many people with eyes open and looking for it. Here in California, we have our border protection stations along all the major routes into California. So goods are continuously being inspected there, especially from the spotted lanternfly current infested area. So things are inspected at the actual border station, and then in addition to that, when there are things like a moving truck that could potentially have things inside that may have egg masses on, like lawn furniture or other things like that, if they can't be inspected at the border station, they're issued what's called a 008A. It's just the name of the form, but it's a form that goes to the destination county agricultural commissioner so that they can conduct a follow-up inspection once those goods have been unpacked at the destination. And as I mentioned before, we do conduct inspections of these air cargo flights. These are companies like Amazon, FedEx, UPS, other logistics companies that are moving products around. We're looking at those planes that have these large bays that are keeping them open where insects can fly in. We're doing those inspections primarily for Japanese beetle, but continue to keep an eye out for spotted lanternfly. A couple other things that are going on now. CDFA will be conducting a risk starting within the next few weeks. This is going to be targeted towards a number of locations that are along what we consider high-risk pathways. So those include the receivers of shipments from the infested area, those 008A receivers that I mentioned. Also rail yards. The spotted lanternfly has been observed laying eggs on rail cars, and so there's a concern that those rail cars can end up here. So we're looking at a couple of the major rail yards where a lot of cars from the east end up. In addition to that, we're looking at other pathways where it could get here sort of as a secondary introduction, not from the east coast of the U.S., but from Asia again. So those include stone importers, which is thought to be the pathway that originally got here as an egg mass. and also the ports in California, where we conduct a lot of inspection for other insects, and so we will be tacking on looking for that tree of heaven and also spotted lanternfly around those locations. We're also kicking off a Master Gardener Sentinel program. This is kind of a train the trainer program where we'll use the Master Gardener network to sort of get the word out about spotted lanternfly and another pest, a pink hibiscus mealybug, to get sort of educated and motivated eyes in the public to sort of, again, be looking for this pest, and so that we can hopefully find it well before it becomes an issue or becomes heavily established. Again, as I mentioned, we won't be having a sort of typical detection trapping or trapping network out there like we do for a lot of other invasive pests, because we don't have a trap and a lure that's sort of effective to that degree. So we're really reliant on the only sort of survey method is visual survey. We are developing a state exterior quarantine in California that will be harmonized. It's being worked with other Western states to sort of so that they all kind of match up in terms of what things will be regulated as they move into California to hopefully prevent the movement of spotted lanternfly into California. CDFA has also given a grant to the tune of about $500,000 to Mark Hoddle at UC Riverside to conduct some research on biological control agents that would be particularly well suited to California. We're getting that research started now so that hopefully we can have something ready to go before we actually find spotted lanternfly here in California. More broadly, there are sort of other, or I should point out that there are a lot of research efforts sort of across the country directed at this pest. So one thing that's being looked at is the rearing of spotted lanternfly in colonies in the laboratory or greenhouse. Just speaking from personal experience doing research in biocontrol on agricultural pests, it's a lot easier to do that research and any kind of research on a pest when you can actually grow it and have a colony that's sort of under controlled conditions in a laboratory, as opposed to being completely reliant on field studies where there's a lot more variables that you can't account for. This has proven a challenge with spotted lanternfly, but the USDA Appalachian Fruit Research Station has reported some success just this year, getting it to complete its life cycle sort of completely in captivity. Their protocol that they're using is fairly space and resource intensive, so there's still work being done on that because it's a fairly arduous process getting them to complete their development and lay eggs and give them enough sort of healthy plant material for them to feed on to keep them happy. I mentioned lures sort of not being that available for this pest. There is a lure that is being investigated by USDA, especially the Plant Protection and Quarantine Science and Technology folks, and the University of Florida. The lure is methyl salicylate, which is actually the flavor wintergreen, and that's or the flavor that gets used for a lot of wintergreen tasting things like Listerine mouthwash. It's being used in some sticky band traps that are being used more of a monitoring tool in the infested area to determine how heavily infested the area is. This is like it's about a foot wide roll of sticky tape that is wrapped around the trunk of a tree. It's a not very clean trap. You know, lots of other things get stuck to it. They have issues with birds and squirrels and other stuff like that. So, but they have found that those traps that have the lure on them do end up catching more than those that don't. But it's still kind of to be determined how much we could really rely on that lure to actually pull them in and use them in more of a detection or control measure, as opposed to just monitoring an area that we already know is heavily infested. In terms of pesticides, so far state extension services have been making IPM recommendations. Penn State and Cornell seem to be doing a good job of this. They have nice information on their websites. A couple products have been given emergency exemptions in some of those areas for usage. Also, biocontrol is being looked at by a whole bunch of folks. So USDA, University of Delaware, as I mentioned before, UC Riverside, and also a project funded by the Canadian government through CABI are looking at parasitic wasps that, again, lay their eggs in the eggs of spotted lanternfly and sort of kill them that way. They eat them kind of from the inside out. So those are being looked at, and also Cornell and Penn State are investigating some of these entomopathogenic fungi that might be potentially used and potentially even formulated into a kind of biopesticide that could be applied to a crop situation, to a vineyard. There is work being done and needs to be done on the host range of spotted lanternfly. It's been recorded feeding on a whole bunch of pests on a whole bunch of plants. But again, as we've seen, it's primarily associated with tree of heaven and more in the U.S. on grapes. And there's some questions as to whether tree of heaven is necessary for its development or not. Some folks have been trying to rear it exclusively on grapes and see if they can get it to complete its life cycle. That work is still ongoing. And just in terms of communication, USDA has some information on their website, but it's largely been states issuing bulletins and alerts to sort of within their states through extension services, through departments of agriculture, and through the National Plant Board to sort of get the word out. Thinking about what else we can do. A proposed framework for action was shared with this stakeholder group from CDFA. So a few things that are included are formulating a stakeholder working group looking at the possibility of using these verticillium wilt pathogens as a biocontrol agent, not against the pest, but against tree of heaven. So that would be something that we would need to be sort of investigated, whether that would be even feasible, especially, or something that people would be interested in here in California. We really need to facilitate the development of a national economic impact analysis, really that's emphasized on grapes. As I said, that's the commodity that's really getting hit the hardest. And having an economic impact analysis like that really then would help allow states to sort of get and leverage funding for program operations through their legislature and through USDA and through other stakeholder groups. It's going to be really important to engage USDA leadership on this pest. Every time we have a operations call with USDA about pretty much any pest, they continually stress the importance of hearing from stakeholders, hearing from industry about sort of what needs to happen and what they need to protect their industry. It would also be potentially helpful to have a multi-agency coordination group for research coordination for this pest. As I mentioned, there's a lot of organizations and a lot of universities interested in doing research on this pest, and having sort of national coordination on that would really be helpful to sort of make sure that we get research that leads to potential solutions and tools sort of as quickly and efficiently as possible. We really need to develop a spotted lanternfly public outreach plan for California. Everything we've heard from our counterparts on the East Coast is that you need to have an outreach plan in place before it gets here, because once it shows up, the phone is ringing off the hook, because again, this is a very visible pest. Everybody sees it. Everybody's asking, what is this thing that is in giant numbers swarming in my yard, flying against my windows, and just making a mess of everything. So having an outreach plan in place before we have a detection here in California would be really important. And related to that, having a grape industry outreach plan for California that could then be sort of applied to, across the nation for the grape industry would be really valuable, so that there can be, coordinated and having the best information out there in the grower's hands in terms of what to do when it shows up and how to prevent it from showing up. Just also on that note, sort of with the pesticides that are being used against it currently, it's only a couple modes of action, and so there are concerns about insecticide resistance management against this pest. It's kind of a nightmare for that, because it's a pest that requires repeated treatments, and there's only a few products that can be used against it. And so that's just sort of one example of some of the things that need to be looked at. At that, I will just stress that in the meantime, it may be a good idea to have your membership familiarize themselves with Tree of Heaven, what it looks like, start getting an eye for what it looks like and finding it near and around your vineyards. If you happen to see something that looks like this, please call we have an exotic pest hotline in California that can sort of get the information on the location and coordinate with state and county personnel and make sure that we get out there and look for it. In the meantime, I think at this point, we'll look to take any questions you all have. And again, thank you for your time and participation today.
Dr. Kaiser, thank you so much for that very informative presentation. As a reminder, if anybody has questions, please feel free to type them in on the questions tab. If you'd like to ask a question verbally, simply raise your hand on the dashboard and I can call on you and unmute you. So we do have some questions that came in. The first one, Dr. Kaiser, you stated that the federal USDA is taking a state-first approach to controlling and quarantining the spotted lanternfly. Does this mean that more or less resources and attention to spotted lanternfly?
Well, the USDA is contributing a lot of attention and resources to spotted lanternfly, but they're in a regulatory space where they're not necessarily interested in getting engaged in implementing quarantines for which there is no exit strategy. Several years ago, they developed a term called non-regulatory solutions, and this is a perfect example of a pest that maybe 15 or 20 years ago, they would have jumped in and had a federal domestic quarantine. But if they don't see a way out of a quarantine, and for a pest like this, where there's so many unknowns, they're very apprehensive about getting involved in a quarantine that's difficult for them to get out of. So they're relying on the states. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't fund state activities. They're a very good partner back in Pennsylvania, funding survey and treatment. But typically, USDA, if they don't have a federal domestic quarantine, they don't fund state exterior quarantines. But, and using P.D. Gwitz as an example, they do fund P.D. Gwitz programs. So there's precedent for them funding state efforts. So I think there is an opportunity here to ensure that if the states can get together and implement state exterior quarantines to slow the spread, artificial spread, that there's precedent for the USDA supporting that. So it's not just specifically left up to the states to have to support their own exclusion activities.
Perfect, thank you. Kind of on to the next question. When you were discussing the differences between the European grapevine moth and spotted lanternfly, you said no to mating disruption for spotted lanternfly. Does this mean that the pheromones have yet to be identified, or that it is not believed that mating disruption would work?
I think it's a little bit twofold. So yes, there currently is no pheromone that is used, and as a second hand, we don't necessarily know. There probably are pheromones involved. Almost all insects use them for, to some degree, for mating. But again, these kinds of insects, these plant hoppers, also rely on other things like vibrations through the substrate and other stuff like that. And so it is a little bit of a question if I'll say that it seems to me highly unlikely that there would be a pheromone that would be as effective as it was against or as it was for disrupting mating in European grapevine moths.
Perfect. And kind of going along the same line of mating population. So if a mating population of spotted lanternfly is found in a California wine grape growing area, then what kinds of control measures do you anticipate would be instituted to prevent the spread of the pest?
We probably take our cues from what they're currently attempting to do in Pennsylvania. But we have one great advantage here in California is that we have CEQA to comply with, and they don't. But we looked at what is working elsewhere and what we can reasonably do here.
Okay, perfect. And going along the lines of making sure that the spotted lanternfly does not get into California, what efforts are being made in the current host areas for inspections prior to leaving the infested counties?
Well, a number of the infested counties or the states with infestations have county-level state interior quarantines to try to restrict that movement. There is a permit system that's in place, at least in Pennsylvania, where folks that are moving goods out of the quarantine area have to have a permit. I don't know if there's more.
The nursery stock is
okay.
A heavily regulated article, so they put nurseries under compliance agreement. They have to inspect their plants and treat their plants before they're allowed to move out of the area as well. So they're doing a very good job in the infested states trying to contain the artificial movement, because it's a big concern to them as well. Our state exterior quarantine will look a lot like what their restrictions are, so that we're not adding to their workload. We're just sort of honoring it. So if you can meet the Pennsylvania state quarantine movement requirements to move within Pennsylvania, you'll probably be able to move the requirements to move all the way to California.
Perfect, thank you. And I know you guys talked about the effort to work with the master gardeners to get more people aware of spotted lanternfly, but are there additional efforts being made to make the public aware of spotted lanternfly? And how can everybody on this call kind of help in that effort?
I guess that goes to our proposed action items, is to come up with a robust public outreach campaign and then have the back end capacity to process all of the reports from the public and triage them, and then be able to respond with state or county, federal survey staff, qualified staff to go out and investigate. Because this is pretty much a visual only confirmation, that would be a lot of work involved in that. So that's why having a good plan before we just tell the public, be on the lookout. Relate a little story about the murder hornet. Last fall, when it was just the Asian giant hornet, it didn't generate that much attention from the public. But this spring, when it was rebranded the murder hornet, the phones rang off the hook. So we're appreciative of the public's attention to these things. We prefer to have it done in a more controlled, purposeful manner. So having a plan and then rolling out that plan and being prepared to respond is the way we'd like to move forward with this.
Perfect. And is there currently a proposal in place for the plan or resources allocated? And do you know what that timeline would look like?
So the CDFA plant division, unfortunately, we don't have a robust public outreach budget, but we are eager to collaborate with other entities that do have robust outreach budgets and work collaboratively with them to develop something that we would partner with them.
Perfect, thank you. kind of going backwards a little bit, more talking about the tree of heaven. Since it is an invasive pest, can it be removed from riparian areas? And if so, does some type of approval need to be obtained first?
Yeah, so for any sort of state-initiated action, we'd have to have CEQA compliance to do anything like that. So that's a years-long process. But I think because it is an invasive plant, we've got natural allies with, California Invasive Plant Council and other invasive species organizations that already had a pre-existing grudge against tree of heaven before it was known that it was a prime host for spotted lanternfly. So I think there's, once again, lots of opportunity for partnerships there. People can do whatever they want on their own private property. Land management agencies can also be engaged to do what they need to do. So I think, once again, it's an area where there's lots of potential partnerships. We just have to explore those and take advantage of them and leverage those relationships.
Perfect. And kind of staying on line of the tree of heaven, can you expand on the role in the cycle, and is it required as a host for spotted lanternfly?
Yeah, so at this point, we don't know. It was initially, or it was thought that it may be, required. What seems to happen is the adults tend to congregate towards tree of heaven sort of right after they transition from being nymphs to being adults. And they seem to be attracted to especially tall individual trees, tree of heaven. From there, then they lay eggs all over the place, and then the next year the nymphs are out and they're feeding on other things. We don't know if they need to feed on tree of heaven to complete their development or not. So that is something that I've heard has been being looked at in terms of trying to rear them just in cages in the field, only on grapevines back east. But again, with that, I'm not entirely, we still don't know enough about its basic biology and life cycle to know for sure.
And that's a big concern for Pennsylvania as well. They're concerned if we go through all the effort to remove as much tree of heaven as we can, and that would be considerable effort, will it even matter? Will it just shift host and do just as well on maples or oaks or birches? That is unknown. Right now, it just seems to really like tree of heaven and do very well amassing and congregating on it and using tree of heaven as the launching pad to annoy people and damage grapes.
There's still a lot of research that needs to happen, and there's some research that is actually occurring right now on tree of heaven. We just don't have solid answers yet on it.
Perfect. Thank you guys very much for that. That looks like all of the questions that we have in at the time, and we are right on that 11 o'clock hour, bringing us to an hour webinar. I would like to thank everybody on this call once again. Thank you very much, Dr. Cline, Dr. Kaiser, and the CDFA for your partnership in this webinar. On behalf of COG, Wine Institute, and Family Winemakers of California, we thank you guys for joining us. A recording of this webinar will be available to you this afternoon. And if you do have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to us. I will also include that Pest hotline number in my recording to you guys this afternoon. We encourage you to share all of this information with all of your members and with the general public, and we will keep you guys informed on our efforts moving forward. So with that, if you guys, Dr. Cline or Dr. Kaiser, do you have any closing remarks?
Just appreciate everybody participating in this presentation.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
All right, thank you, everybody. We will now end the webinar.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thanks, Natalie.